My name is Fran McGregor. Well, actually, I'll be formal. Frances Catherine McGregor Smeele.
Oh,
I was raised in McGregor. I was born 70 years ago in the old hospital, which doesn't exist anymore, where High Street Place is now. And I was raised up in a log cabin up on the mountain. My father built that cabin. He bought it for $50 an acre back in, say, 1937, the year I was born. And then about before 1940, or around 1940, we moved in. And Dad built the cabin, basically on his own with Mom's help, because so many of his friends had gone to the war. But as I say, I was born in 1937, Scottish, and my father's people, and my mother was a Mennonite. And so you talk about doer and practical and paying attention to detail people, you know, work hard, you know, pay attention to God, be good and all that sort of thing. I kind of strayed away from those precepts a bit, I think. But anyway, okay, I had 4 siblings, all brothers, born after me, a pair of twins, and then 2 other brothers. And Nelson, when I was a little kid, I started at the Central School, and then of course in grade 7, started at Trafalgar. We just called it the junior high school. And then the Nelson High School was what they call up on Latimer Street. It's called the elementary, South Nelson Elementary. But Nelson, when I was young, was a very, it was actually part of Empire. It was our ethnic music, songs we sang, ethnic songs we sang were Welsh, Scottish, and Irish. We were an outpost of Empire. Nelson was not at all the liberal place it was now. It was very, very, I would say, biased, class conscious, which was kind of interesting because my father was a dyed-in-the-wool, a fellow with socialist principles, and we were all very much aware of what was going on in the world as far as politics go. I first started listening to the radio. My father, we have no electricity up in the, you know, this is way above the mountain station, above South Nelson, up in the woods in the clearing. I had early intimations of what was going on in the world because my father built a crystal radio, and he had earphones and so on, and he allowed us all to listen, and some of it would be the war news, and I was, you know, it was long before I went to school. And then when times got better, because everybody was taken, my father was working in the mines, terrible place, but when so many of his friends went away to the war, then Dad, who was refused, he thought he'd get an army, my mother would get an army pension if he was killed. That would be a form of security. So, but they didn't take him. They said he had a bad heart, which lasted him for 68 years. And Dad got a job in CPR, and very soon became a ditcher engineer, which meant he had a great big, what would you call it, steam shovel on a flat car. And it was called a ditcher because it kept all the ditches clear, which meant that it kept the tracks all straight and running and dry. And he also cleared up after avalanches and mudslides, and tore up track, and helped to build new bridges, etc. So when times got better anyway, there was a battery-operated radio, which was always turned on for the news, the war news. So of course, we little kids, we thought that the Japanese and the Germans were just going to come right over the mountain after us, you know? We had no idea that we were living, we had no idea of geography or anything, but we were very worried little people. And I remember very clearly when the war was over. There was dancing in the streets, there were parties. This is in the summertime, so this would have been, what, VJ Day, I think, eh? I'm not sure. But it was in the summertime.
Oh, VE was Victory.
Oh, yeah.
That was May, and then VJ in
Yeah.
August.
Okay, well, this was, I definitely remember hot weather. And my mother took his kids down to see what was going on, the early part of the celebrations. Then we went home on the streetcar. Yeah, the streetcar ran all over Nelson and did a far better job than the buses did in the first few years. I sure missed those streetcars. Of course, we did things like, you were allowed to open up the windows. We'd open up the windows and of course it showed people going by, strictly against the rules. And in the wintertime they had a little coal stove right there at the front near the conductor, and with a coal scuttle and everything had to be sort of, I guess it was attached very firmly. But we liked, in the wintertime, we liked to sit close to where the little stove was on the streetcar, because that was your heat. Yeah, all these things that happened, 70 years. So anyway, okay, what did I do? Finished high school and applied to nursing school, Vancouver General. Well, Vancouver General did not care for my math marks at all. And they said, go ahead and take grade 13 and bring your math marks up. Well, they thought I was staying one more month with my crazy mother. One more month in Nelson. They had another thing coming, or let alone a year. So no grade 13 for me. I found out that they were desperate for psych nurses. And they had shortened the program to 2 years instead of 3. And you got paid a very large stipend compared to per month, which was over $100 a month, compared to what other nursing students got. So that sold me, you know. They didn't care about my math marks at all. Later on I got my RN, but that's another story. But so I was at Essendale. It was called Essendale then, the mental hospital. There were 6,000 people there, and several buildings, great big buildings, and Crease Clinic there. When you first became mentally ill or deranged in whatever interesting way you were, then you went to Crease Clinic to be assessed, and you probably stayed there first. And then when you came in again, well, then it was up the hill into Essendale. It was all one, you know. Beautiful grounds, beautiful trees. Very sad. It was a very sad for the people living there, but you know, for young nursing students, it was great. We were close to Vancouver. I'd never seen a big city before. Bunches of us went in on the bus because a lot of the girls knew Vancouver and were from the area. So I discovered Vancouver and the art gallery, and that I could belong to more than one library. I belonged to the Coquitlam Library, the Essendale Medical Library, and the Vancouver Library, which one was right in the Robson area. And discovered Stanley Park and all those wonderful things. And I had to have different book bags, speaking of libraries, because I had all these because, well, I gotta tell you about my obsession with books, is because here in the library, you could take only one book out at a time, and it had to be on like a storybook, like a children's illustrated book. They would not let me have nonfiction until I was 12 years old. Well, and I couldn't do anything about getting extra books from my mother or anything, because my mother was only allowed to take out something like 3 books at a time. So this was dreadful. But anyway, I managed, because my mother joined the some kind of a book club. I forget. Remember, it was a big deal then, and she used to get all the bestsellers, and a lot of them were bodice rippers, which I didn't really understand. You know, I'm thinking of Forever Amber and stuff like that. Anyway, my mother, of course, she kept all these books under her bed that she didn't want us to read, me, because I was the reader. Of course, I was the babysitter. Well, I knew where those books were, and I read them all. And then I always tell the story, too, of what really saved my life as far as books goes. And I think I just had this obsession. I was always looking for a good story. And thank God my father was doing some renovating, and we lived in this, we had moved down the hill from the cabin in the meantime. So this would be in the late 40s and early 50s. Yeah, we moved down in 46, down the hill to a bigger house, but still above the mountain station. So we were still mountain kids. And my dad chopped through a hole in the wall because he was going to put in some drawers and some closets, and he wanted to see. And by golly, a whole bookcase full of books, and mostly, and they weren't valuable or anything like first editions or anything like that, but a lot of Victorian writers, all of Dickens just about, Vanity Fair, some Brontes, a dictionary, not a dictionary, encyclopedias from 1910. A whole set of encyclopedias, lots of interesting stuff in there for kids. And of course my mother allowed us to despoil these books and cut it. They had beautiful black and white photos, animals, explorers, you know, lovely, and once in a while a fair amount of colored illustrations, but wonderful photographs. And but those books saved my life. I had a very turbulent childhood, and those books absolutely saved my life. I was reading Dickens by the time, before I was 10 years old. And I've been hooked ever since. I have a whole set of Dickens. I've read his books. Whenever I have a time of stress, I always have Dickens beside my bed. And when I went to Australia, and I knew that wherever I go traveling, I like to always have a book to read at bed. Well, you can't pack a whole bunch of books along because I can read very quickly. So I just take along a Dickens. I know that'll last me the trip. Yeah. Does anybody want to ask questions? So anyway,
Yeah, tell us about this man you married.
Oh God, yes, my pal. When I was, and the way we met too is funny, eh? I was a student nurse. I was 19, living of course out in the nurses' home out at Essendale. And I had two girlfriends that were, one was in normal school in Victoria, and one was the class behind me. She had stayed home for an extra year. Her mother was a new widow. And so anyway, they had gotten to meet some Dutch boys on their holidays. And so, what? Only 2 minutes! You're kidding!
Keep going.
No, I'm absolutely flabbergasted.
Just
Well,
roll
anyway,
on.
we met on a blind date. We met on a blind date. And it was so funny, and we went to the Forbidden City, which is was where you brought your own booze in a brown paper bag, and then they charge you a fortune for the ice in the mix. That's the way they had the crazy liquor laws. Anyway, Frank and I were the only ones that did get drunk. I didn't like going out on blind dates, number one. And so Frank drove everybody home, and that started a wonderful relationship of 40 years. We knew each other for 40 years. Married for 38. Most wonderful man. Had 2 children with him, and we adopted another one. So we had 3 children together, and we went through good times and hard times and sad times, and I looked after him when he died, and a wonderful guy. And he was Dutch, and a very, very, and he was a forester, and so we lived all over BC and Alberta with his jobs. And I learned far more than I wanted to learn about trees. Okay, so what can I say? I've had a very good life. I've had an interesting life. I've had some interesting trips, including going rafting down the Grand Canyon to celebrate my 65th birthday. Toughest trip in my life, best trip of my life. I have very interesting children and grandchildren. I have interesting friends, including the company of older women. I have had a very good life. And from here on in, well, I hope for lots more interesting chapters, but I have had a very good life. There you have it, kid.
Great.
Well, did I ever
What
tell
are
you
we-
guys the story? I missed the story about a terrific Grey Cup weekend in Vancouver. I'm telling you. Of course, we landed up at Georgia and Granville, and of course we were in a convertible, because one of my fellow nursing students' dad owned a car dealership, and he was always giving her old used cars. Well, one was a convertible. Ooh. Anyway, so we were cruising up and down and yelling with everybody else, of course, and probably impaired. And then we landed up at several parties and hotel rooms, like the place was just wide open. And then we landed up in this pub, and of course we're all underage. But of course nobody was checking ID at the time. And I just don't know how it occurred, but I landed up standing on a table with a couple of sailors, and we were singing. Oh, it's just so shocking. We were singing "Roll Me Over." Can you stand it?
I can definitely picture it.
God, that was hilarious. And while I was doing it, I was laughing because I thought, I wonder if I'll ever tell this to my grandchildren. And I haven't. I think I should.
Yes. I can remember climbing a tree once when I was drunk.
That would be good.
Boy, that's pretty dangerous.
Who
Pretty
got you
daring.
down? Well, I don't know. There were 3 or 4 of us, and we were. Well, I got down eventually.
Where was it? Where was this, Mark?
In Alberta. I can't remember exactly. I think it was when I was still in training. Oh, I didn't. That's
Oh
right.
God, I've been to some interesting parties.
Everybody,
Okay.
I think you can all participate. I'd like you to participate. So that means asking questions or making comments and things. So it will probably find it easier to handle this brief 15-minute film if you do. So
I know you were born around the Potteries, but
Right.
can you speak about where that was in England?
yes,
And what
okay.
that was kind of about?
Yes, I was born in the Potteries in England, and
Your name first.
Oh, thank you. My name is Phyllis Dale, and I was born in the Potteries in England. So that really is a major factor about who I am, was the fact that, yes, I was born in England and I grew up in England, and I didn't emigrate to Canada until I was 21. So my formative founding years were spent in England. And Gloria here asked me about the Potteries where I was born. The Potteries were a part of the Midlands in England, and for those who might know, there's a poem that says, "The Midlands are soggy and unkind," because actually, unfortunately, there's a lot of dampness in the Midlands in England. But the potteries themselves are actually the potteries. They're factories that were where the famous earthenware in China was being made. China, like the Daltons and Wedgwood and so on, were all being made there. And the familiar sight was of bottle kilns, actually shaped like something like that, which are constantly spewing out smoke into the atmosphere. And it was also an area of mining. There were coal mines in the area, steel smelting going on in the area. It was an area called the Five Towns. The Five Towns were indeed 5 towns that were strung out in a line on a main road, and collectively they were all known as the Potteries. So I didn't live in actually one of the 5 towns. I lived a little bit outside that in a place called Newcastle. But I was born in Longport, just outside one of the main towns. And I was born in 1933, and so by the time I was the only child of 2 parents, neither of whom came from this particular area. My mother came from the Birmingham area, and my father had come from London in England. And I grew up in that first 5 years before the Second World War broke out. Everything was relatively okay and relatively peaceful. And we had moved by the time the Second World War broke out. And that was, to a 5-year-old child, was just sort of an incomprehensible event, basically. I can remember that my father went to work and dug us a shelter in the garden. It was he dug down a pit in the garden and lined it, and then put a corrugated metal roof on it. And this was where we had to go when there were air raids and when we were under attack by German bombers, which we were at the first part of the war. The first part of the war, there was, because of all the industry in the area, there was a lot of attacks, particularly at night. And I can remember being carried out, sort of half asleep and feeling very frightened and shivery, and being put taken down into this shelter so that we could be there in the event of being bombed. The bombing happened. We never actually bombed. It came a little close sometimes, but we never actually were damaged. So that was sort of what was happening for me. The fact that I did grow up between the ages of 5 and 45 and 12 in the Second World War definitely affected me and affected the way I was, I think, because I was starting school at age 5, and one thing we had to do was carry gas masks around with us all the time. And we had been taught how to put on a gas mask in the event of gas, and that we had to. I can remember an event in which I was coming home from school for lunch, walking home from school, and 2 large planes came over, and of course they'd be propeller-driven planes. I wasn't aware of whether they were enemy or friendly, and so I obediently got my gas mask off my shoulder and put it on, and lay down by the side of a wall, which is what we had been told to do if we were caught out in the open in the event of attack. And what I had not checked or had forgotten to check was the fact that the sirens hadn't gone off. The siren would go off to warn of an air attack. And so I lay there by the wall with my gas mask on, waiting, and people would walk by me and look at me and not say anything. Eventually I decided, well, the planes had gone, and it didn't look as if we were in any trouble after all. So I took it off, and when I got back home, Mum said, "Why are you so late? Your lunch is cold," you know. Anyway, after the first year and a half, I think the hostilities sort of dropped away in our part. The Germans concentrated more on places like Coventry and London, and our area we weren't under attack very, very much. In fact, my area became a part where children were evacuated to out of the London district. So we had a lot of evacuated children that came into my area for the latter part of the war, and we had to evacuate children that came to stay with us, 2 boys from London. And so they were part of my family for a little while, but they weren't very happy. In fact, they were very unhappy. They wanted to be home with their mum, and their father was away in the war, and so they really weren't very happy to be, sent out to live with strangers a long way from home. There was the elder boy was trying to look after the younger one, and the younger one was being terribly undisciplined and really very unhappy. So eventually they went back home to London and took their risks with the bombing that was going on there. But they went back to their mum, which is really what they wanted to do. So, what else? Any questions? Anybody at this point, or any comments?
What about your education?
My education. Okay. Well, I was educated. First of all, we started school at age 5, and I was much too young to go to school at that stage, emotionally and in a prepared way. I just wasn't ready for school at all. And it wasn't a very nice school either. It was the local public school, and it was both boys and girls at that school, and which may sound a little odd, but I'll come to that in a minute. And so it was the whole area that we were living in was a working class area, and very much the remains of the Industrial Revolution, housing and so on. And it was a very rough school, in other words, so I wasn't happy there at all. And my mother would tell the tale of how I used to walk up the hill from our house, and she would watch me getting slower and slower as I got to the top of the hill, and then I'd stop and turn and come running back down crying. So it really wasn't. Nevertheless, I was still taken to school, so it wasn't a very successful experience for me at all for a couple of years. And I can remember suddenly, probably when I was about 7, I should think, one day going to school, and another girl came up to me and said, I had a big bag of sweets, and said, we were looking for you, we've got a big bag of sweets, would you like to come and have a sweet? And I can remember it was like a light bulb going on. It was like, oh, hey, this could be fun. Maybe this, maybe even being with other children, remember I was an only child, this would be fun. And it seemed like something opened up for me at that time, and something changed dramatically. As I said, the school was a tough one, and I got caned for doing silly things like talking too much and dropping stitches in my knitting and such things. I remember one day I came home and my hands were so swollen that my mother was quite horrified and decided that I should go to another school. So she hunted around, and she found a school, a Catholic school, convent school, which we weren't Catholics by any means, but it was a school that would take anybody without examinations. And at this point, I was not very good at passing examinations. So this is the school I went to, and actually it was very good. It was an excellent school to go to. It was an all-girls school, an all-girls high school. Somebody's coming in right the door right now. Yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah, somebody's just coming into the door, so that's why a little break here. It was an all-girls, well, it was St. Dominic's High School for Girls was the name of the school. It was an excellent school. It was very well taught by both religious and secular staff. And I was after a few weeks or months, I got very comfortable in that school. I was part of what was called the group that was non-Catholic. That means I wasn't a Catholic. They called us non-Catholics. They didn't call us Protestants or anything else. And we were treated fairly well, I mean, as part of the general group, except for the subject of religion. And at the subject of religion, the non-Catholics studied the Old Testament, while the Catholics studied their catechism. What I really loved at the school was my favorite subjects was certainly English literature. Like Fran ahead of me, I loved reading and loved books. And also, I was very physical, very sporty. So I loved German, and I loved participating in sports. We had tennis, and we had netball, and I was chosen as captain of the netball team. And we challenged different schools, and we had an inter-school league, and that was great fun. Things got considerably better in my life by about that time. And so I left school, though, at age 15, which at that point in time was quite a legitimate time to leave school if you weren't going to go on to university, which at that point I wasn't going to do. I came to that later in life. And I left school, I went to a commercial college, and I learned all the commercial subjects, and then I went to work in a bank. That was very acceptable too. Very respectable. I worked in the bank for about 3 years, and by then I was very interested in boys and men, and I met my husband around about age 18. He was already, he was 5 years older than me and was already qualified as an architect, and we got married. I was married at age 19, and I had my first child at age 20. And I used to say, I'm a mother and I don't have a vote. Because in those days we didn't have a vote until you were 21 years old. So, and that was in England. So we emigrated. I'm kind of condensing things at this point. I haven't got much time left. So I've got 2 minutes left, Gloria just tells me. My husband and I and one child, we emigrated to Canada when I was 21. We came out to Edmonton, first of all, because that's where Albert managed to get a job. We stayed a brief while there, and then we moved down to Calgary. And we were in Calgary for the next 18 years or so. And that's where I had 3 more children. And we settled in Calgary. We lived in a variety of different places in the city, kind of moving up each time. And then we eventually went out to Springbank and built a house out in the Springbank area. By then I had 3 children. When I had the youngest one into kindergarten or nursery school, kindergarten, I started back in my own education. And I went to, I completed my high school diploma, and then I went to University of Calgary and started working on a degree in psychology. And in the next 8 years I did an undergraduate and a graduate degree in psychology. So, and by that time my children were all sort of growing up pretty well. And I went to work with doing research work, which was basically the main interest that I had. Not, I wasn't interested so much in the clinical work as in the research work. And I think that must be about my time, isn't it, at that point? You know, I've got a fraction of a minute left, but I'm not going to cover the rest of my life in a fraction of a minute.
What brought you to Nelson?
That's what brought me to Nelson. You know, that's going to take a lot longer than half a minute.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Another time.
I see the red lights on.
So that's what a lot of people thought. We didn't know, of course, about the heavy water. And we didn't know about Hanfield down in Washington.
Either, right?
No,
Lots of people still don't know about Hanfield down in Washington.
no.
And,
With its leaking containers
yeah, that's right.
now, nuclear waste.
There was a big conference in Nelson on Hanford.
Hanford.
When was that,
I can't remember the date, but it was organized by Sandra, what's her name? Hartline and somebody else.
Well,
Yeah.
This was
Some time ago.
war then.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. 1980s.
well, do you know that Hanford released nuclear clouds? And they were doing research, in the name of research, and they were tracking the clouds. And of course they only tracked them as far as the US border. Canadians didn't count. And the Canadian government didn't give a rip about anything. And so they came right over Nelson here apparently, so it didn't matter that your mother, we all were raised on organic food then because my mother didn't use pesticides and nobody else did either. My mother had a huge garden and we had fruit trees. And we had, you know, our water supply from the reservoir. Well, all that junk from Hanford just came floating over us in gentle little swirls, I suppose, and just landed on everything and on our food and on our gardens and on our water. And I'd always be about 10 years old, I think, when they did this. So about 47.
Did people know what
But
was
did
happening?
people
Well, no,
They
we didn't know anything about it till afterward. This is what I, is this your understanding?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. I think I was 10 years old. And of course we found this out, you know, I found out about,
My name is Margaret Mooney, and I decided that I'm a wannabe writer. So I decided I needed a title for this, and then I came up with like 4 of them. So, and one was My Long and Winding Road to Feminism, or How Feminism Saved Me, and this is subtitled And Left Me Alone in My Old Age. Or, what is a good Catholic girl like you doing in a place like this?
All right.
But I'm not a Catholic girl anymore. But basically, on the second wave, there were so many excellent cartoons. Like the cartoons were just, that's something we should do, is collect 60s cartoons. And but the one that's stuck in my mind showed a woman lying on the ground. A guy has got his big boot on her neck, and she's saying, "Excuse me, sir, but somehow or other I've gotten my neck under your boot." That describes me to a T. I was a very sweet, loving, faithful Catholic housewife. And I married a man who had a brain tumor when he was 20 years old and was supposed to die. And he didn't. And that was like a whole bunch of things came together. It was at Saskatoon, and they had just gotten the Betatron, and they had just gotten Dr. Findell, who trained with the doctor in the East, Penfield, trained with Wilder Penfield. And I don't think he'd been there very long, but I think the Betatron had been there about 3 years. And anyway, this was just, we were both at University of Saskatchewan. We'd been seeing each other for, September till Christmas. He came out for New Year's, which was a big fiasco. I had planned to go home, and I disappointed my parents by saying I wasn't coming home. I was in Swift Current, that's where I trained. And so I was so angry about this that I never contacted him. And he didn't contact me. And I thought, okay, like, we don't have to have a breakup, like, it's just happening. Well, lo and behold, after a couple of months, his sister called me and she said, Bob had a brain tumor operation on the 2nd of January, which was the day after he left. No, 3rd of January, which is the day after he left Swift Current. So, guilt, horror, he wants you to come. So, so I went to see him. And he was already he'd gone through having hematomas after the operation. But he was paralyzed down one side. He literally had to learn to speak and write and walk and everything you learn when you're 2 years old, basically he had to do that all over again. And he did, and he never looked back, and he was the absolute darling of the brain ward. I mean, like, he was everybody's pet, because as soon as he could talk, he was cracking jokes. And he had more than one nurse in love with him. I was very aware of that. He was in there 3 months. And so the first time I went, I said, well, it's just friendly of me to go and visit him, and then he wanted me to come back, and one thing led to another. So anyway, we were married and had 2 kids before he was cleared by the cancer clinic. He had to keep going back. We were in Lethbridge then, and he had to keep going back to Saskatoon to get checked up at the cancer clinic. And I think they give you 5 years or something like that. So we were, well into our Catholic marriage. It was very difficult. His dad was an absolute darling. He was always on my side, but every time something came up, he said, it's because of brain tumor. Like, everything was blamed on that. So anyway, we moved to Swift Current. He was a teacher. And I had been an X-ray technician, but I'd had 2 miscarriages, so I was desperately trying to get pregnant, and I just didn't even look for jobs because you don't want to be pregnant working at an X-ray. Our lives went on. it was all geared towards his education. Because, well, the first year we married, we were in Saskatoon, he finished his B.Ed, and then it was always summer class, summer class, summer class. And then by the time we had 5 kids, he decided he wanted to get he thought his master's. It turned out we stayed for a PhD in Oregon. So there was nothing much, there was certainly nothing, no women's lib stuff happening in Lethbridge. Is a very, we used to say redneck in the old days, but that's not nice. Very conservative, you know, nothing like that. But they were also had just gotten their university. So things were bubbling for Lethbridge and changing. And anyway, by the time we went down for our first summer school, which was 1968, yeah, 1968, we just had 4 kids then, 3 boys and a girl. And I felt really free because it was probably the first time since I got married that I hadn't been pregnant or with a baby. My one and only daughter was 3, and she is the most independent child I've ever seen. And so, you know, I didn't have to baby her or run after her. So we moved into, we rented the very small house of an English prof who was away for the summer. And he had the most beautiful office with 3 walls of books, floor to ceiling bookshelves.
Huh.
And so I basically sent my kids to the neighbors. No, my kids got involved with some kids their age across the street, so they were there a lot. And I settled in and read. And of course I read the book that all of us middle class women read, which was The Feminine Mistake. And just went, well, I should say when we went to Oregon, I was so depressed that I wouldn't drive the car because I was afraid that I would, you know, that my subconscious would do something, you know. But I didn't have a plan or anything like that. I was just like really, really depressed. And so I read that book. So and I was on antidepressants, sleeping pills, and so I read that book, and it was just like, like things just opened up for me. And I had a really good summer. I didn't read just that book, but I read all sorts of books, and we had a really good summer there. And then went back to Lethbridge again, another year there with kind of nothing was really happening. And we went again in '69. I guess that was another summer. And here I am, still drugged up. And there's a woman at the University of Oregon, Susan, teaching a 10-day course called Women on the Move. And feminism was not mentioned. It was kind of like pre-feminism. And so I don't know how I got to go to that. The woman whose kids my kids played with was a real earth mother. Like, she didn't care if there were 45 kids in her yard. Like, she just loved it. So she may have looked after my kids. I don't know, but I went to that course. And I literally, like, emptied all those pills down the toilet forever and ever. I've never been on anything like that again. Like I said, feminism wasn't mentioned. But what she did was, you know, it was basically how to get out of the desperate housewife syndrome is what it was. So she talked about volunteering, which I'd already done, you know, a ton of that, and university. So, like, that is what I wanted. I wanted to go to university. So I went back and took one course, but then everything got scrambled because then we went, you know, in '69 we went for the duration, which turned out to be 3 years. But things were so hopping at the University of Oregon. I went to things like a great big, there still weren't classes, there still weren't women's studies classes, but I went to, it was in a big auditorium, I don't know where. This was real, you know, in-your-face feminism. After the talks, women were invited to stand up and tell their stories. And women were saying things about doctors getting funny with them and naming names. And everything, like all sorts of things that I had never really heard of. Battered women who were saying what they went through. And it was very, very, very mind-blowing to be at that, you know. 5 minutes. Anyway, that really started it. I went to the very first ever feminist course there, which was Anthropology of Women. And it was open to everybody, but all but 2 of the guys withdrew from her course. And again, that was like she gave assignments like write an essay about something that could only have happened to you because you were a woman. Happy or sad or whatever, like having a baby, just anything. It was wide open. So, and she was a very good speaker. She opened up the class to people, again, for people to tell their stories. I mean, it was a very exciting time to be living in the late 60s because women were so ready to tell their stories that it was almost vomiting out of their mouths. And so then I came back to Lethbridge, and our Lethbridge was very supposed to be very progressive, open. You know, people could plan their own courses and everything. It's not like that at all anymore. So it attracted people like my friend Rita Moyer and 3 more young people, and they really got things going there. And then there was consciousness raising groups, and you know, it would have been better had I been their age, but you know, me and a few other women were struggling along 20 years older than them, and they did some really crazy things. I was going to university at the time, and my husband by that time was a prof there, and I used Mooney, so except for the education profs, most of the profs didn't know that I was connected to him. But it was hard because, you know, these young girls are running around, you know, calling all men MCPs, and if you're a married woman, like, you know, like your husband doesn't like to be called an MCP, so like there's this, you know, how do I sort of go forward and do what I know I have to do, like I knew I had to go to university. I actually ended up with a social work degree. I did a little bit of social work. Oh dear. Oh dear. What else?
So what came after the good Catholic wife?
The bad divorcee. That's a good story because we had a no-fault divorce, and actually, as it turned out, neither of us remarried. So it just went into the barrel, you know, there wasn't any court or anything. And when the decree came, it was International Women's Day.
Oh, that for symbolism?
Yeah. And it, you know, it had been months since we'd put it in, and it was just like, well, it's going to come any day. And we were actually still living together, I think, at that point. I don't know. But, yeah, like all that was really, really hard because when you get divorced after 30-some years of marriage, like all the friends around you who are struggling with their marriage, it terrifies them. So they really don't want to have anything to do with you.
That's right.
So, you know, I can't say I lost my friends, but I lost a lot of Catholic friends. But, you know, I already had one foot out the door. Anyway, that's my long winding road. to feminism. And now I'm a raging granny.
Yay.
Influences I'd like to cite was the MS magazine. I was one of the first subscribers and subscribed till it died. Also the dinner party, Judy Chicago show in Calgary. Anybody?
I
That's
did
how much
get
of
to
that?
that. I lived in Lethbridge, but I didn't get up to that.
Those were really key
Yeah.
items in Germaine's Greer's book.
Of
And
course, Germany.
Eisler, somebody Eisler, an anthropologist. Really
Rianne
formative.
Eisler.
It takes a hell of a toll on a marriage, though. I mean, let's face it.
Yeah.
Those are just a couple of things that popped into my mind. But I've never forgotten the dinner party, and it was a group of women on the board of the Glenbow brought that to that city.
Oh.
That's right.
Do you remember the year? Was it 70s or?
I don't
I think it
remember.
was 70s.
I took my daughter.
I saw that.
In the
It was,
about 75,
yeah,
76.
in the late, I thought the latest 70s.
And I went to Vancouver twice to hear Gloria Steinem speak. She was worthwhile. She was brought in by a branch of the Canadian Bar Association that deals in helping women's legal causes. There was a benefit for that branch of law. I don't know whether it still exists. So those are things just popped into my mind. I haven't thought of for years.
Which is why,
Gee,
you know,
we've
I
been
started
together
off by
for-
saying I want you all to be involved in it.
More than
It didn't
10
happen that
years.
way,
So,
in fact.
and I think this is the third time we've done storytelling that I recall.
Yes.
There, yes.
Yeah, and each time when we did it was kind of a little more interesting, I thought. And maybe when we do storytelling, you know, we can ask ourselves the question like, you know, what is it? What is the story? I mean, birth, school, whatever. I mean, yeah, those are important things, but I always have the feeling there's something under the surface of that that's more important about our lives. I think you touched on some of that for sure.
I just feel like feminism saved my life.
Yeah, yeah.
That's important.
Yeah, you went into what was really the focal point, the really interesting, or the change was so dramatic for you.
Yeah.
And so you didn't go into childhood and go on and on and on. So in a sense, she was doing the kind of thing that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Beth.
And I
Just
think the
went
question
right
is,
into it.
what is it in your life that makes you who you are today?
Exactly.
How did you get to this place? You know, what were those events in your life that influenced? And you touched on it too, how much being during the war.
Yeah.
And also living in an area where there's a lot of poverty and a very working class, and how that affects, you know, our values and all of that.
Well, the thing was,
Being an only child.
yeah, being an only child, the thing was that, of course, the time limit, as it happened,
Yeah.
just cut it off
Yes,
at
yes.
that particular point. When you asked how did you get to Nelson, I mean, that
That's a
that
story
is,
within
yes,
itself.
is a story.
Well, you know, if
yeah.
you'd given me enough time, I could have been absolutely brilliant.
I could have. I go for preparation.
Hey, listen, I didn't even tell you guys about when